Okay. For those of you who haven't been here before, I'm Srinivas Vishu. I'm one of the IBD attendings at the University of Michigan, and I do this talk every year with my colleague Dan Sharp, who is an IBD patient. So I'm just going to swing through my slides first and kind of briefly overview some alternative therapies for IBD, what some of the evidence is, and kind of where things are going. And then Dan is going to jump in and do his portion of the talk. And then if you guys could sort of hold your questions until the end, that would be the most helpful. Okay, so IBD, so alternative therapies, we use the term complementary and alternative medicine to encompass these, or CAM. And believe it or not, there's actually an NIH institute that looks at CAM, and they fund grants and studies and various things. So I just want to get that terminology out of the way. Very briefly, I'm going to discuss marijuana use, diet, FMT, and then some probiotic supplements, and then some exercise, yoga, and acupuncture. And the reason I've sorted it this way is because it's based on my practice and the questions that I get. And I get the most questions about marijuana, and I get a fair number of questions about diet. And then increasingly, I get questions about FMT or microbiota transplant as well. So before we jump into that, I just want to talk about what a clinical trial is and how we prove something. And when physicians say that there's not enough evidence for something, what we mean is there's not this sort of a trial. So first, we take patients, and we give some of them medicines, and then we give some of them a placebo or a sugar pill. Then we actually blind everybody. So nobody knows who got what, and then we ask a simple question: who got better? And this is what a clinical trial is. Now, interestingly, about 10 to 30%, depending on what disease process and stuff you're looking at, will get better just with a placebo, and that's called a placebo effect. So they've actually received nothing and just kind of got better on their own. Maybe it's because they felt they were getting better, who knows? So when we talk about a drug as working, what we really mean is it's got to be better than placebo. So things like Remicade, Humira, Stelara, they're all better than placebo. And we have a word for this. We call this a randomized controlled trial, or RCT. For doctors, this is the gold standard. And when we say that there's not enough evidence for marijuana or diet, so on and so forth, what we really mean is that there is not a randomized controlled trial to really look at these things. So with that terminology out of the way, I'm going to move on. Okay, so CAM, what really is CAM? So CAM is basically any sort of supplemental, sometimes unproven approach. And as we just discussed, typically what that means for us is there are no or very low quality trials. It doesn't mean that stuff doesn't work. Some of that stuff may work. It just means that we haven't really been able to study it in a serious way yet for a variety of different reasons. IBD patients know that there's lots of interest in complementary and alternative medicine, and many people use it in addition to standard therapy. There are any number of surveys on it. I just happen to pick one. About 60% of people, probably more, use some type of CAM, depending on how you describe CAM. And I bet that number of 28% for dietary management is substantially higher in actual life. The one thing we caution against is stopping your Remicade and continuing, turmeric or something. That won't work. So the internet, be very careful about the internet. And Dan is going to talk a lot more about this. You can find the answer to anything you want in the way you want it. This can be very dangerous and very misleading. And you have to remember the placebo effect, which is why you never trust single testimonials. This is why physicians blind everybody and give them stuff. Okay, so marijuana. THC is the psychoactive part, and CBD is the non-psychoactive part. I know many of you know this. The idea is that CBD in particular is thought to engage pathways for pain and reward, and it may have some anti-inflammatory effect, although that's pretty controversial and has not been studied really well. So in IBD, most of the studies that have been done combining marijuana have been done with continued standard therapy. And the good news is that it may improve symptoms. And I have a lot of patients who take either CBD or marijuana, and they do feel like it improves their symptoms. The bad is that it doesn't really seem to improve any inflammation. What's worse is that it's been associated with stopping standard therapy and thus higher rates of surgery. So no randomized controlled trials, so the evidence is pretty poor quality, and you can understand this. It's very difficult to give somebody like a placebo marijuana, for example. Diet, lots and lots of interest in diet. One would think it would be the ideal way to manage disease, and it's convenient. There are some diets that do have some evidence. In particular, the elemental diet has the best data, pretty good quality data in kids, and reasonable quality data in adults. There's a major problem with it though. It's terrible tasting, so I'm not really sure how long somebody can continue on something like that. Other diets you've probably heard about are the specific carbohydrate diet and the anti-inflammatory diet. They're related. The whole idea behind those two is that you exclude certain carbohydrates, and the thinking is that if you exclude certain carbohydrates, you shift the gut microbiome, which may improve symptoms in some. Low FODMAP, probably also everybody's heard about that. And the low FODMAP is again one of those things where it may improve symptoms in some. There was a recent study about this in IBD in one of our major journals, and the findings were not that great actually, but certainly some people had improved symptoms. There's a lot of recent interest in the Mediterranean diet, which may improve IBD, and in diets that are sort of lower in meat, processed foods, which also may improve IBD. All of that is very skeptical, and the evidence is based not on forward-moving trials, but on people that have eaten either Mediterranean diets or on people that just eat less sort of processed foods. That I'm not sure it'll pan out in the future, but at least people are thinking about it. So some of the major problems with diet is that it's really challenging to study. There's obviously no placebo arm and no blinding arm. Adherence is a big thing. I mean, how long can people actually change their diet? Could you do it for a week, 2 weeks, 10 years? And these are some of the problems that studies that have been done intervening diet-wise have faced. People really have a tough time changing their diet. The third thing is right now, there's no real evidence that dietary changes alter inflammation. That may happen in the future, but as of right now, you know, if you ask your provider, what is a diet I can be on to improve my IBD, there's a little bit of a disconnect, because what a provider hears is, what is a diet I can be on to make my Remicade more effective or something? And the answer to that is no. But sometimes all patients mean is, what kind of diet can I be on to improve my symptoms, which are different. So in that sense, diet, I think, certainly will improve symptoms in some people. So some controlled trials, okay quality evidence, but again, it's very tough to execute these for obvious reasons. So what's the future with diet? Okay, so the idea is that trials are ongoing, and a lot of them use really two major approaches, and this is obviously a simplification of reality, but basically they focus on either removing factors that are thought to be inflammatory or adding factors that are thought to be anti-inflammatory. And you can go to clinicaltrials.gov and take a look at what's available, but they broadly fit into those two things. And that's where a lot of this academic kind of diet research is going, including several of these types of trials that we do at the University of Michigan or are planning on doing. The broad goal across the field, I would say, is to move from these generic exclusion diets. And what do I mean by that? Diets that exclude certain foods. So FODMAPs, specific carbohydrate diet, gluten-free diet. Those are all exclusion diets because they exclude certain foods. And it's moving towards diets that are more tailored. And the idea is they're tailored to either enhance anti-inflammatory factors or remove pro-inflammatory factors. All right, so FMT. FMT is very, very, very complicated. We know that the gut bacteria is involved in IBD, and it's not just the gut bacteria, it's also the fungi in your gut and the viruses in your gut. There are loads of bacteria in your gut, over 10 to the 9th. That's a big, big, big number, and not all the bacteria are evenly distributed in that figure. You get a sense, essentially your colon is sort of enriched more than other parts of your intestine. But it is not as simple as taking the bad bacteria and replacing it with good bacteria for a variety of reasons. One, we don't know what we're doing yet. So in ulcerative colitis, there are some randomized controlled trials or trials that have what's called a crossover design. They're pretty decent. There is some evidence from those trials that it may improve inflammation and reduce medication use. One of the major issues is that how frequently can somebody get like an FMT, and does it work any better than, say, Humira? Because if you can get an FMT frequently, but it works less well than Humira or whatever, why would you want to do it? So that's one thing. Crohn's, there are not any controlled trials yet, and we're not really sure if it works in Crohn's so easily, and therefore there hasn't been any sort of clear benefit demonstrated. Now, the other thing about FMT is that it may be risky. You can transfer infections and other bad pathogens, and there have been some deaths reported in FMTs. But the biggest reason is that we don't really know what we're doing yet. We know that within these clinical trials, some people who get an FMT benefit. We know that some features of the transplanted microbiome are beneficial. And we also know that some donors appear to be better than other donors in terms of transmitting this benefit, but we don't know the whys behind any of this. So what's the future? So many trials are ongoing, and just like diet, people are moving to sort of tailored things. So they're really kind of binned into, I would say, three sort of groups. One is they're transferring specific groups of bacteria where you think that this pool of bacteria is maybe anti-inflammatory. And then another set really transfer specific bacteria themselves. And also there's a move to turn these things into a swallowable pill, which is way better than getting an FMT via a colonoscopy. Supplements. So I'm just going to touch a little bit on this. So, turmeric does have some evidence in ulcerative colitis, really when used in conjunction with 5-ASAs, and 5-ASAs are mesalamine, Roesa is a topical 5-ASA, Colazol, Delzacol, Lialda, those are all 5-ASAs. It's not really for severe ulcerative colitis, and there's that says no evidence of benefit in UC. It's supposed to be Crohn's. There's no evidence of benefit in Crohn's, and all of these are not randomized controlled trials. They are trials, but they're not randomized controlled trials. Probiotics. So VSL number 3 may have a role in pouchitis. Again, there's no randomized controlled trials. And Dan may talk about this a little bit, but I believe there was some controversy about getting VSL number 3 now, and whether the product that is sold as VSL number 3 right now, which I think many of you have heard of, is actually the initial product that was studied. A major caveat to supplements and vitamins, and I know Dan's going to talk about this as well, is that these are not FDA regulated, which means something very specific to providers. We don't know what's in them. They are not required to undergo testing in the same way that medicines are, so it's just tough for us to tell you what's in them.
Yeah, if I could just add it now, because I don't have anything about VSL number 3 in my part, but I think offhand the VisBiome has supposedly the original formulation of VSL3. The guy that made VSL3 started another company and then sued the VSL3 company because they were saying it was his formula, but it was totally different. So yeah, you'd have to look into it to be sure you're getting what you think you're getting.
yeah, exactly. And that was my understanding as well, Dan. Okay, exercise and yoga. Okay, so the bottom line behind exercise and yoga, again, these are studies that are really hard to do, but I don't know who doesn't feel better when they do physical activity, and it's pretty much good for what ails you. And even if it doesn't sort of make you at least feel better, it's good for heart disease, diabetes. There's pretty much no reason people shouldn't be doing this just as a function of life, to be honest. All right, so bottom line, marijuana maybe improves symptoms, probably doesn't improve inflammation. Diet probably improves symptoms. We hope it improves inflammation. Stay tuned. FMT, in ulcerative colitis, there's a role. In Crohn's, nothing yet, but once again, stay tuned. Supplements, not FDA regulated, maybe some, I don't really know. And exercise, yoga, mindfulness, all these things they can only make you feel better. So that's the end of my portion, and I'm just going to kick it to Dan now for his part. Peter.
Cool. Can we get a switch over on the screen? Awesome.
Should be set.
Okay. So is it good? Can you see mine?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Good.
great. All right, thanks, Dr. Bishu. That's a great introduction or lead into what I'm going to talk about. If you don't, well, you can download the slides if you want, I think, from GoToWebinar. They're also available on my website, dansharpibd.org. You'll see the P2PEP2020 post right at the top. Okay, so alternative medicine as a concept, I think, is more of a brand than anything. And I think it's important to rethink alternative medicine as patients. And rather than thinking of something being an alternative, we should think about what sort of evidence exists. And again, Dr. Bishu covered a lot of this as far as what evidence does exist for a lot of popular therapies. But I'm going to demonstrate how changing our perception or changing our focus away from just thinking about so-called conventional medicine and so-called alternative medicine and just focusing on the evidence is far more important. A problem that I see is that because alternative medicine is a brand, a lot of things get lumped together into alternative. And as Dr. Bishu talked about, things like exercise and diet and things like that are often considered alternative, and I don't think that's necessarily should be the case. It's a well-accepted scientific fact, really, that exercise is good for people. So that shouldn't be considered alternative. But the problem is then when you start hearing claims about exercise having specific effects or specific types of exercises, doing something in particular for your IBD, maybe it isn't backed by evidence. And so when you start seeing things like diet and exercise associated with alternative medicine, it kind of legitimizes some of the other things that are far less evidence-based. So if you just start seeing positive things like associated with a bunch of non-evidence-based and potentially dangerous things, it can confuse the issue. Of course, it can be very tough to evaluate information and understand what is actually evidence-based. I think most patients want something that has evidence supporting it. The problem is that if you go looking online, as Dr. Bishu said, you can kind of find something that's going to support whatever you're looking for. It just might not be correct. I'm not going to dwell too much on this. Dr. Bishu gave a really nice introduction to randomized controlled trials. As far as medical studies, as he said, that's considered the gold standard. Most studies that you're going to see, medical studies, can't actually determine cause and effect. So understanding the difference between correlation and causation is really important because there's a lot of claims that are made about various therapies or herbal supplements that say this can cause this or this can treat that. And if there is a study on it, most of the time it's actually just finding some sort of correlation. Once again, opinions, anecdotes, those are not evidence. It's important for studies to be controlled, which, as Dr. Bishu explained, means comparing a treatment group to a group that's getting a placebo or maybe some other treatment. But it also means that the researchers are setting things up in a way that the outcome is unlikely to be due to chance, and you're getting rid of a lot of variables that might cause confusing results. Another thing I think is worth pointing out is that animal studies are not human studies. I see a lot of studies or headlines about some herb treating something, and if you actually dig into it, it's just something that was done in an animal model, and very rarely do animal studies translate into human studies. Above all, it's important to look at the big picture. If you don't want to just focus on one study, because then you're kind of cherry picking the stuff that you maybe want to believe in, or you're just have wishful thinking. You want to look at the whole body of evidence about something and also look at expert consensus. Where a lot of confusion comes in, though, is the way that medical studies are reported. The number one tip I would give is to ignore headlines because they sensationalize things. Second cat chased the first cat in here. Thanks, Remus. Okay, so ignore headlines and actually dig into the articles, see what's being cited. Be wary of emotional language because that's an easy way for writers to convince you of something. Anytime someone says something is 100% safe or effective, you should disregard everything else they're saying because nothing is 100% safe or effective. If you're interested in some sort of alternative therapy or an herb or something, you need to acknowledge the fact that if something is capable of having a physiological effect on you, it's capable of hurting you. There's a limit to everything. Nothing is 100% safe, and nothing has ever been shown to be 100% effective. If you save the slides, I shared some additional resources you can explore later about evaluating information and even how to read a science paper and kind of be able to detect some of the red flags of bad science. Because even if there are a lot of studies, not all studies are particularly good. And particularly in the media, things get misinterpreted or overinterpreted, meaning the effect of something is exaggerated, or something that was just found to be an association is turned into a cause and effect. So again, because alternative medicine is more of a brand or a concept, there's a lot of things that people associate with it. And one of them is that it is safe. And it's a dangerous assumption to make. One of the ways this association has been built up over the years is that alternative is often described as being natural. A lot of the therapies are called natural. This is a very unhelpful term. It's poorly defined. And if you're actually looking at things in nature, something that comes directly from nature, there's plenty of things in nature that would not hesitate to kill you given the chance. And there's a lot of dangerous plants and bacteria. This picture here is C. diff. If you've ever had a C. diff infection, you know that is nothing to mess around with. But C. diff is just as natural as, actually, I mean, I would say C. diff is more natural than a lot of the probiotics you're going to buy on the shelf because they're made in the lab. So if you're just making a decision about something based on whether or not it's natural, you might run into trouble. There's a logical fallacy called appeal to nature. The idea, or the fallacy exists because there's a break in logic where you go from nature or natural is good, therefore it's safe, but you don't have any definition of nature, and you don't have any reason to think that just something that is natural is safe. Or rather, natural is safe, treatment is good, but there is no reason to think natural is safe. All right, so to elaborate on that, there's actually a lot of evidence showing that dietary and herbal supplements that are sold in stores more often than not don't contain what they advertise on the label. A lot of the times they contain additional things which may be harmful and cause liver injury or other sort of conditions. A lot of them don't contain any of the advertised ingredients at all. The problem with this, or the reason this exists, is because dietary and herbal supplements are not regulated the way drugs are. There's no requirement for a supplement manufacturer to prove that its product contains what it says, or that it's safe, or can do what they claim it can do when it hits the market. It's really only after something hits the market, as far as supplements go, that things start being monitored, because eventually they'll start finding out that a bunch of people that took a supplement become ill. It's sort of just up to the manufacturer to ensure these things on their own, but it isn't regulated the way a drug is. So owing to that, there has been increasing incidence over the years of liver injury due to supplements, and a conservative estimate is that there are at least 23,000 emergency department visits every year due to supplements. And it's conservative in large part because those are only the cases that patients are disclosing what supplements they took when they went to the ED. So going back to diet and nutrition, as I said, I don't think nutrition and diet as a whole should be associated with alternative medicine because there's obviously a lot that we can say with relative certainty about diet and nutrition in general and regarding IBD, but there are also a lot of claims that are not evidence-based, and there are a lot of them on the internet. And so I would say to be wary of anyone who is calling themselves a nutritionist who is not a licensed professional. Nutritionist is not an accredited title, so anyone can call themselves a nutritionist. And there have been some studies, including one in 2014, finding that a lot of the patient-targeted dietary recommendations found on the internet are not only conflicting, but highly restrictive. And restrictive diets are associated with nutritional deficiencies and then worse outcomes in IBD. So it's not something you want to take lightly. It might seem like it's relatively benign to stick with some diet plan because someone told you it was good, but there is a lot that can go wrong if you are restricting your diet for no reason. No matter what you are doing to treat your disease, the important question you should be asking is, are you treating it? I think people with IBD are familiar with a lot of the things that go wrong when you're not actually treating your disease: poor quality of life, poor sleep, increased risk of unplanned surgery. But there's other things like increased risk of blood clots, heart attack, and stroke that a lot of people aren't familiar with. So given that, it's concerning that studies have found that the use of complementary alternative medicine is actually associated with lower adherence to medical therapy. The assumption there is that people who are taking alternative medicine for IBD are assuming that it's treating their disease, and so they stop taking their evidence-based medicine. There have also been studies showing that the use of complementary alternative medicine is associated with reduced health-related quality of life. Again, that may be due to the adherence issue. If people are stopping the medications that are actually treating the inflammation over time, their health worsens, and so their quality of life worsens. If you have the slide, you can delve into this more later, but these are just different aspects of health-related quality of life. You can see IBD patients who are not using alternative medicine in red. So that's the effect that just IBD and their whole IBD experience overall affects their quality of life. But the ones who are taking alternative medicine, their quality of life is much lower. So another study recently was looking at cancer survival rates in people who are taking alternative medicine. And I highlighted the colorectal cancer survival rates here because colorectal cancer is associated with IBD, with untreated IBD being the major concern. The 5-year survival rate for patients who are using alternative medicine was about 33%. And for those using proven cancer therapies, it was about 79%. Startlingly, all of the patients were non-metastatic at the start, which means that their cancer is isolated to one area. It hasn't spread around. So a lot of the patients that died of a curable cancer because they were using alternative medicine. So to dive a little bit more into this idea of treating a disease and asking whether or not you're treating it, it's important to understand that you need to focus on both your symptoms and disease, and that disease activity in IBD, meaning the level of inflammation in your body, doesn't always correlate well with how you're feeling. So somebody could feel really well, but have active inflammation inside that's building up over time. Likewise, somebody could feel terrible, and not really have much inflammation. It could be due to something else like IBS. So it's important to be looking at both of those things. I've heard Dr. Rubin from University of Chicago say that symptom improvement leads to better quality of life, and disease improvement is better quality of life over time. There's been some studies looking at the use of objective biomarkers in combination with clinical symptoms, and it has found that the outcomes when you're combining subjective and objective are better than if you're just looking at symptoms alone, which was kind of more the case years ago. There was less of a focus on the objective because there was this assumption for years that there was a direct correlation between symptoms and disease activity. So treat to target is objective targets of disease control with serial adjustments to therapy. Is the idea of treat to target, which is kind of a newer concept in IBD, is that you have to simplify things, you might have a big long-term goal, like to get yourself into complete endoscopic remission. And along the way, you set a lot of smaller targets, like getting your fecal calprotectin levels normalized. And so a physician will monitor your fecal calprotectin or CRP or whatever it is at regular intervals, and then adjust your treatment as needed. And so this algorithm here, which is going to be impossible to read without downloading the slide and probably zooming, is an algorithm that Dr. Rubin and Dr. Noah Cleveland from University of Chicago developed a few years back that is made for people who would like to try alternative therapies while they aren't encouraging their patients to go on these therapies. Sometimes people really would like to try something. Maybe they're feeling like they've run out of other options. And so this presents a way to hold their treatments accountable, because that's really what this is all about, is holding your treatments accountable and making sure they're doing what they should be doing. So they will come up with a plan, say where they give 3 months or 6 months or something to go through a treat to target approach using whatever therapies has been agreed upon between the patient and physician. And if things don't improve, using all these objective markers at the end of that time, then the agreement is then you will switch to something else. And I think it's important to share something like this because I think sometimes patients get this idea that physicians are totally against all alternative things, or that maybe they're against it for the wrong reasons. And I think that your gastroenterologist has the same goals as you, and that they want you to be healthy. We maybe just have different ideas about how to get there. So it's important to always work together and come up with plans together to do things the right way. And I think that should lead us into some question time.
Okay. So let me hop back in, and we've got several questions. Let's start with one from Dana Strakowski. Can turmeric elevate liver enzymes or certain probiotics?
So to the best of my knowledge, and Peter, you can chime in, or Dan, I don't believe turmeric elevates liver enzymes. Turmeric is a pretty normal part of the diet of a lot of people, including Indians. Certain probiotics, they very well may. I think one of the issues is that they're not FDA regulated. As Dan pointed out, I don't really. Most of us don't really know what's in sort of most of these things. Typically, it's not like the probiotic itself. It would be whatever other carrier chemicals are in there. And then very broadly, almost anything can cause liver enzyme abnormalities. Just about anything, and it can happen at any time.
Yeah, taken in large enough quantity. And I think that's often the tipping point is if you're taking 8 grams of turmeric, it's probably different from food grade turmeric you get. Another question about, is it fair to compare the evidence standards of FDA approved drugs, which obviously have patents and companies behind them, to alternative therapies which are not as well funded? And how well funded is NCCAM anyway?
Yeah, good question. Good question. So I'm actually going to put a grant into NCCAM myself. I think that it's a fair point to say that perhaps some alternative medicine trials have not been done because there's no funding agency. And I think a reality of modern medicine, capitalism, whatever, the drug companies have spent a lot of money developing these products, and seeing it through the trial phase is a part of what they reap. And it does benefit people insofar as if they're not doing this, there won't be new drugs available. But I think the broader question of, can you design a trial? I mean, forget the funding mechanism. I mean, can you design like a reasonable trial, and what kind of evidence is the best kind of evidence? Because at the end of the day, I'm going to be seeing a patient and I'm going to have to give them like an answer. In good conscience, it's very tough for us to say whether there's money for it or not. It's tough for us as providers to say product X or approach X is safe if we just don't feel like a certain standard has been met. And I think all providers and probably all patients have a different perspective on this. I know for me, I often end up saying it's probably safe if you want to take it, but I can't guarantee you it's beneficial. And usually that's the approach I end up doing.
Yeah, it's hard, especially when it's unregulated. And a lot of these are fairly fly-by-night companies that, years ago there was a weight loss supplement that unfortunately was contaminated and caused a fair amount of deaths fairly quickly, but it got pulled. The company reincorporated under a new name and brought out a new product that was a little bit cleaner. So it's hard. Another question. Love this talk, but many looked at CAM because the data for traditional treatments is not encouraging, even in the original literature. It seems the stats for biologics have high side effects and seemingly low success rates for remission. How do you talk to patients about the data for the FDA-approved therapies and the numbers in conventional treatments? And does that affect why they're seeking out CAM?
Dan, I would appreciate your input on sort of why you think patients are seeking out CAM. So jump in anytime. From my perspective as a provider, yes. So biologics, this is an interesting area, right? I mean, biologics, they are effective for sure. I think that's one thing we could certainly say. And I know, psychologically, people read all these side effects, or they see that commercial for Stelara on TV and somebody's talking really fast at the end about how a bunch of bad stuff is going to happen. I often end up telling my patients, a couple of things. The key actually is, what's the probability that's going to happen to you? And typically they're low. And at this point, for things like Remicade and Humira in particular, we've had about 20 years worth of data. They're pretty safe, to be honest, including the cancer risk. I think to that second point, though, is how effective are they? We wish they were more effective, let's put it that way. And that's why there are continually new drugs coming out. And we wish that if somebody got on an effective drug, it stayed effective in them forever, which is a second problem. Now, my reading as a provider in terms of why people seek CAM, I think there's two components in there. I think one component is there's a sense that these medications are somehow unnatural, and they're sort of harming the body just being on the medications, and long-term risks are unknown. And I'm going to ask Dan to weigh in on that. And I think the second component is, I think sometimes there's a sense of sort of like hope or control over your own disease process that initiating some of these things you don't need a doctor for give people. And I think that does have some positive psychological impacts, so I don't want to deflate that completely. Dan, chime in?
Yeah, going back to the side effect thing, I think it's worth understanding that if you're looking at like a drug commercial, which unfortunately we have to deal with in the States, or even a pamphlet for a drug, and it lists all these side effects, it's important to understand that any sort of adverse effect that happens to a patient while they're studying the drug in the clinical trials gets listed. So there's a lot of scary things that are listed that maybe aren't necessarily associated with the treatment itself. It's just the process of reporting all these things that happen during clinical trials. Beyond that, yeah, I mean, I know that lots of patients look to alternative medicine because they're concerned about the safety of conventional therapies. Um, yeah, Sarah just said, and the cost too. And I think there's sort of sometimes patients also become disillusioned by medicine and maybe have bad experiences with physicians or don't feel like they're heard. And it's a lot easier for I don't know, some alternative medicine practitioner who sees 3 patients a day to spend an hour and a half with each one. Um, but whether or not they're actually offering something that can help them is a different issue. I think as far as like safety, I think for me, I guess I have a kind of different perspective than maybe a lot of patients because I grew up before there were biologics. So I remember my options being steroids, 5-ASA, which I have Crohn's, so it wasn't doing me any good. And then there was the thiopurines, and none of it worked. And I was on the steroids all the time. And steroids are known to be, the worst drug that you can be on, especially long-term in IBD. So when biologics became an option, I jumped at the chance to be on them. And we're getting more and more biologics available to us as patients, and there's a trend in safety, I think, as they become kind of more targeted in a way. I don't know, you guys can tell me if I'm wrong in thinking that, but I think TNFs have been shown over the years to be much safer than a lot of people maybe even assumed 10 years ago. But there's still like Entyvio and Stelara, I think, are generally considered to be even safer in a lot of ways.
I was just going to say, Dan, our own Peter Higgins published a pretty large paper in conjunction with one of our other IBD investigators looking at cancer on anti-TNFs, and did not look like there was an increased risk at all. I'm talking about your paper, Peter.
That was in patients who had previously had cancer and was looking for recurrence, which for years we worried a lot about. And with people started their anti-TNF at least 2 years after their cancer therapy, it didn't seem to make much difference in a very, very large data set. So, over time, I think we're being more reassured. I have one more question I think is really interesting and a common conception. And this is from Marjorie McGregor asking, do doctors receive incentives for prescribing certain drugs?
I wish I did. I could afford a better car. No, we don't. We don't, and that would be considered pretty highly unethical. And in fact, most universities have very, very strict rules about what pharmaceutical companies can do. We can't even give out free samples, and the reason for that is specifically to avoid incentivizing providers. We really, there's essentially been a firewall set aside, and the University of Michigan, I would say, is very strict. You can look us all up. There's something called the Sunrise Act. You can literally Google the Sunrise Act to see who's gotten money from pharmaceutical companies. You can look up any University of Michigan provider, compare it to whatever other university you want. I think I got like $50 or something like that.
Probably had a very expensive sandwich.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. No, so to answer your question, we don't get any incentives from companies, and I personally don't do any talks because my university doesn't allow me to. Most mainline universities have pretty similar rules. Either way, it's not as if the Takeda people are giving me money under the table to prescribe more Entyvio. That would just be considered unethical across the country, really.
There are a lot of regulations, including the Sunshine Act. Sunshine Act isn't perfect because it also includes any money you receive for conducting a clinical trial. So I unfortunately get tagged with, I conducted clinical trials, so it looks like I've received a lot of money. I actually have not. But there is one tiny loophole in the United States, just so people know about it, because many years ago, cancer therapies were very expensive. And if you lived in a rural area, no pharmacies would carry them because they were so expensive. And to prevent folks from having to drive to a big city to get cancer therapy, Congress created a loophole so that oncologists can stock and take a percentage of the cost of a cancer therapy. That's the one loophole in the United States. So, and it's just a percentage, it's not a payment directly to the oncologist, but there's always a percentage tacked on to the price of a chemotherapy that is to reimburse the oncologist for stocking that medication when there's not a great incentive to do so. So, but generally, there are lots and lots of regulations to specifically prevent docs from being incentivized or paid in any way by drug companies to prescribe. I think it's an important point to make.
Hey, can I go back and make a really quick point about the last question?
Yeah.
About the particular part about the effectiveness of biologics. I think it's important to understand that there will probably never be a treatment that's going to work in everyone. And probably, I don't know, there might be something that'll work in everyone. As I pointed out earlier, if you see someone say something is 100% effective, it's pretty dubious. You shouldn't trust anything they say. If our biologics now are working in 30 to 40% of people, it's working really well in a lot of patients. And I think the goal with a lot of researchers is trying to understand which treatment to give to which patient and, you know, at the right time. And I think that's going to make a big difference. Because I know if you say, okay, it works in 30% of patients or 40% of patients, it doesn't seem that good. In my opinion, my perspective has changed on that over the years. I think it's pretty good. The issue is that we just don't necessarily know which patient is going to fall into that 30 or 40%.
Yeah, I agree. I just want to make just one last sort of closing remark about pharmaceutical companies and CAM. I know we're running out of time. I've just been seen looking at the chat box, and there's like a side text that seems to suggest that we're pushing mainline pharmaceutical therapies at the expense of CAM, and I want to be very clear that that's not how at least I perceive it, and I don't think that's how Peter or Michigan IBD perceives it. I think the issue for most providers is we just want the proper trials done and the proper proof, and we do have therapies, we do have trials at the University of Michigan where we are looking at giving people, you know, specific types of microbiome things, or supplementing or withdrawing certain diets. I mean, those are things that we have underway, or we will plan on having underway. So again, it's not that we're pushing pharmaceutical products necessarily. We're pushing proven products, and it just so happens that right now those are the proven approaches. It doesn't mean some stuff there won't work. And then number two, just one thing about pharma companies specifically. It is important to bear in mind that, you know, they're obviously for-profit entities and there's interest involved, but it is important to bear in mind that they do tend to fund educational conferences for patients and providers, and there is a relationship there. And in that regard, I do have a relationship with pharmaceutical companies. Peter does, all providers do, and you kind of have to, because it's a two-way street.
Okay. So thank you very much. If you can both take a peek at the questions and type in answers as best you can for the others related to alternative therapies, we're going to head off to our next presentation, which is our patient med experience panel.